Kicked out of the house as if he were worth nothing, he sees his life crumble in a matter of minutes, carrying only the weight of humiliation and the cruel words he will never forget. The next day, an unexpected encounter calls into question everything he believed to be his own story, revealing clues of a past he never imagined. Between contempt, judgment, and deceptive appearances, each step leads him to a direct confrontation with those who underestimated him. And when the truth finally comes to light, the game turns in such a brutal way that no one is prepared for the consequences. Before discovering how this twist will change everything, don't forget to subscribe for more intense stories full of surprises. The fine rain falling over the Ipiranga neighborhood in São Paulo seemed to accompany the weight that Renato Alves carried on his shoulders that Thursday afternoon. He crossed the wet sidewalk with slow steps, the plastic bag in his right hand containing a roasted chicken and a bottle of juice. That simple combination he had learned to like over the last 3 years since he opened the small dry and wet goods store on Bompasta Street. The business wasn't much, but it was his, and he treated it with the same care he gave to everything he built with his own hands. He was 32 years old, had an unshaven beard, and an easy smile that people around him used to notice. He wasn't the type who entered a room and stole the attention, but he wasn't invisible either. There was something about him that long-time customers described as solidity, the feeling that when Renato said he would do something, he did it. This quality, however, was not enough for Priscilla. Priscilla Fontes was waiting for him sitting in the living room, arms crossed over her chest, the expression of someone who had already decided everything even before opening her mouth. Her hair was tied back, wearing a set he knew well, bought at a sale at the Analia Franco Mall that she frequented with increasing regularity in recent months. She was 29 years old and had the ambition of someone who believes the world must, somehow, compensate her for everything she imagined she deserved since she was a child. Renato placed the bag on the American-style kitchen counter and went to the refrigerator to get water. He noticed the silence before noticing her gaze. It was the kind of silence that preceded a storm, thick, heavy, different from the common silence of an apartment at the end of the day. "We need to talk," she said. He closed the refrigerator and turned around. "I'm here." Priscilla stood up. She walked to the middle of the room like someone occupying a stage, and Renato recognized that movement. It was the same one she made when she wanted to say something she had rehearsed. He waited. "I can't do this anymore, Renato. I can't pretend that this here is working." She swept the apartment with a wide gesture of her arm, as if the space itself were the proof of everything that was wrong. It was a 60-square-meter apartment on the 3rd floor of a building without an elevator, clean organized with plants in the window that she herself had chosen and that he watered every morning. 3 years. 3 years waiting for you to grow, and what do you offer me? A store, a neighborhood store. "I know it's not what you always dreamed of," he began. "It's not about dreams, Renato. It's about reality, about what I need. I'm 29 years old. My friends are traveling to Europe, buying apartments, marrying men who have a future. And I stay here waiting for the day when you're going to decide to be someone." Her voice did not tremble. It was a voice of decision, not of pain. Renato was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor, then at her. "I invested everything in the store. You know that. But it's growing. Last month the revenue went up 20%. 20% of nothing is still nothing." She crossed her arms again. "I've already made a decision, Renato. You need to leave." He heard the words, but they took a second to make complete sense. "Leave? The apartment is in my name. It always was. You contributed half the rent, I know, but the contract is mine. I want you to take your things and leave today." Renato stood looking at her for a long moment. He tried to find some sign of hesitation there, some fracture in that certainty. But there was nothing. What he saw was a woman who had convinced herself she was doing the right thing, and this conviction made everything harder to understand than any scream could have. "There is someone else," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer immediately. Then, "That doesn't matter now. It matters to me. Gilmar is a successful businessman. He has a construction company. He has projects. He can give me what you will never be able to give." She said this without deliberate cruelty, which made it sharper. It was simply her truth, organized and presented with the coldness of someone who had done the math a long time ago. Renato nodded slowly. He walked to the bedroom, opened the wardrobe, and began putting clothes into a backpack. His hands did not shake. There was something inside him that refused to collapse, a resistance that he himself didn't know where it came from. He just knew it was there. He took the documents he kept in a drawer, his cell phone charger, the book he had been reading for weeks, a pair of sneakers. When he left the room with the backpack on his shoulder, she was with her back to him, looking through the window at the wet street below. "You contributed to everything I built in these 3 years," he said, standing at the door. "I know that, Priscilla, and it was with pleasure. But I never treated you as disposable." She didn't turn around. He opened the door, went out and closed it carefully without slamming it. The stairs were damp from the souls of other residents who had arrived with the rain. Renato went down slowly, one step at a time, and when he reached the sidewalk, the rain had stopped. Only the smell of wet earth and washed asphalt remained, that smell that São Paulo has sometimes after the rain, almost a promise of something. He walked to the bus stop, sat on the metal bench, and stayed looking at the passing cars. Nazaré Avenue had slow traffic as usual at that time, and the yellow headlights of the vehicles streaked the puddle of water that had formed next to the curb. Renato rested his elbows on his knees and stayed like that, without haste, letting the afternoon slip away. He didn't have an immediate plan. He would call Carlo later, a longtime friend who had a spare room in his apartment in the Belém neighborhood. They had shared space before, when they were both younger and money was scarcer. Carlo never asked unnecessary questions. That was one of the things Renato most admired about him. While waiting for the bus, he mentally reviewed the last few years. He had arrived in São Paulo from the interior of Minas with little more than the will to build something solid. He worked in a warehouse, in a supermarket, learned logistics, met suppliers, understood how money circulated behind the scenes of simple businesses. When he saved enough to rent the spot on Bom Pastor Street, it was one of the bravest decisions he had ever made. And the store grew in a discreet but consistent way, with loyal customers who valued the personal service that the large chains could not offer. The bus arrived with a roar of the engine and a hiss of brakes. Renato entered, stood near the middle door, his backpack pressed against his chest. The vehicle continued through the city that never stopped, that city that absorbed people's stories without asking for anything in return. When he rang the bell at Carlo's apartment, his friend opened the door, looking like he was in the middle of a nap and didn't care about the lack of explanation. He just said, "The room is there, I know where the key is," and went back to the sofa. Renato sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before lying down. He looked at the ceiling and tried to organize what he felt, but the feeling was one of emptiness more than pain, as if the place where the pain should be was still numb. He knew it would come. For now, there was only the silence of someone else's apartment and the certainty that somehow he would need to rebuild something from there. What Renato didn't know at that instant was that that night would be the last of an entire life. Not because something would end, but because something completely different, something he could never have imagined, was about to begin. And it would all start with an envelope that would arrive at the store door the next morning, brought by a woman in a grey suit who had never set foot in that neighborhood before. The store on Bom Pastor Street opened at 7 in the morning, and Renato had never been late a single day since he raised the shutter for the first time, 3 years ago. That Friday was no different. He woke up before 6 in Carlo's spare room, took a quick shower, ate bread with butter standing in the kitchen, and caught the bus while the city was still in the mode before traffic, when the streets have that quiet quality that disappears shortly after 7:30. He arrived at the store with the weight of the previous day still installed somewhere between his chest and shoulders, but he had learned early on that work had the property of postponing pains that could not be resolved immediately. He opened the padlock, raised the shutter, turned on the lights and began the usual organization, checked the refrigerator stock, noted what needed replenishing, swept the entrance, put the open sign on the glass door. At 7:40, Donna Conceição, who lived in the 2-story house on the corner and bought there every day for 2 years, came in to get her liter of milk and a package of Polvilho biscuits. She asked if he was okay, because he had a different face. He said he was fine, and she accepted the answer without pushing, as people do who know when not to insist. At 8:20, while serving a young man who wanted a pack of cigarettes and a can of energy drink, Renato noticed through the window a woman standing on the sidewalk outside. She wasn't from the neighborhood. That was visible from afar. She was in a well-cut grey suit, high heels, hair tied with precision, a black briefcase on her arm. She looked at the store with the expression of someone confirming an address. After the customer left, she entered. "Good morning. I need to speak with Renato Alves." "That's me." She evaluated him for a second, as if comparing what she saw with some information she had beforehand. Then she slightly opened the briefcase and took out an envelope of thick, beige paper, closed with a seal. "My name is Adriana Fonseca. I am a lawyer for Holding Vasconcelos e Asociados, with an office in Jardins. I came personally because the nature of this matter requires discretion." She placed the envelope on the counter. "This envelope contains information that directly concerns you. I ask that you read it carefully before any reaction." Renato looked at the envelope, then at her. "What kind of information?" "Information about your origin, Mr. Alves, about who you really are." She said this with the neutrality of someone who has been doing this for years, who has learned to deliver life-changing news without letting her own voice carry more weight than necessary. "I will wait outside if you need a moment, but we need to talk right after." She left. Renato stood before the envelope for almost an entire minute. There was something about that woman that prevented him from dismissing the matter as a mistake. She was too serious, too precise to be anything frivolous. He opened the envelope carefully. There were 4 pages on letterhead with dense legal language, but there was an introductory paragraph written more directly. The paragraph said, "Renato Alves, born in Capitolio, Minas Gerais, is recognized as the legitimate son of Armando Vasconcelos, founder of the Grupo Vasconcelos, a conglomerate with operations in agribusiness, real estate and logistics, headquartered in São Paulo and with branches in 6 states. The recognition was formalized by a notarial will registered in a notary office, dated 42 days before the passing of Mr. Armando Vasconcelos, and confers upon Mr. Renato Alves the status of sole heir to the main assets of the group, estimated at a value exceeding 2 billion reais. Renato read the paragraph 3 times. Then he stood looking at the counter. There was a pack of gum near the register, a blue Bic pen without a cap, the notebook where he recorded customer orders. Everything exactly the same as it was 5 minutes before. But something had shifted in the air, like when a window is opened in a closed room, and the pressure changes in a way that is not visible, but is felt. He went to the door. Adriana Fonseca was standing on the sidewalk, looking at the street movement. "Is this real?" he asked, holding up the envelope. She turned around. "It is real, Mr. Alves. I have never heard of any Armando Vasconcelos in my life. I know. Your mother kept the situation secret at the request of Mr. Armando himself, for reasons that are partially documented in the attachments. But he knew of your existence since forever, and in recent years he began actively searching to locate you." Renato took a deep breath. The morning sun was already higher, and Bompastor Street was getting busier. A woman was pushing a street market cart. A dog crossed the sidewalk slowly. The city followed its indifferent rhythm, as it always did, as it would do forever. "I need to verify this," he said. "I can't simply accept a piece of paper and believe that I am the heir to 2 billion reais. Of course, I have provided a letter of introduction for the manager of Banco Meridional at the Avenida Paulista branch. You can go there this very day. They have access to the asset verification system and will confirm everything." She took a business card from her briefcase. "My number is here. When you have confirmed, call me and we will schedule the initial meeting." She left with the same firm steps with which she had arrived. Renato stood at the entrance of the store with the envelope in one hand and the card in the other. He closed the store earlier than ever, put a notice on the shutter and called Carlo asking to borrow the blazer his friend kept for special occasions. He arrived at the Banco Meridional on Paulista by subway, entered the glass-fronted branch, and looked for the reception. A girl in a blue blazer and a standardized smile asked how she could help. I need to speak with the manager. I have a letter of introduction. The girl looked at him with an evaluative speed that she tried to hide and said the manager was busy and that he could wait. He waited in a synthetic leather chair near the entrance. He saw executives being served immediately, without waiting. The manager, a man in his 50s named Edvaldo Marques, left his office twice to talk to colleagues in the hallway, passing by Renato without once looking in his direction. When he was finally called, Edvaldo Marques received him with the minimum cordiality that protocol required. Renato placed the envelope on the table and explained what the lawyer had said. The manager listened with an expression that tried to be neutral but slid towards skepticism with every sentence. Mr. Edvaldo consulted the paper in front of him. Alves, this type of situation, of large-scale inheritance recognition, normally comes accompanied by an extensive legal process. A lawyer's letter is not enough for me to release any kind of information. I don't want you to release anything. I just want you to confirm if what is in this document is true. This requires procedure, and frankly, Mr. Alves, this kind of thing is usually a confusion or an attempted scam. Are you sure about who gave you this information? Renato looked at him. There is a phone number on the paper. For the lawyer, you can call right now. As I said, call now, Renato said. And there was something in his voice that was not aggressive but was unequivocal, a firmness that came from somewhere he himself didn't know how to name at that moment. Edvaldo Marques took the paper with a discreet sigh and dialed the number. There was a short conversation during which his expression changed almost imperceptibly, his lips tightening, his posture becoming slightly more upright. When he hung up, there was a different silence in the room. Edvaldo Marques looked at Renato for a long moment before speaking. I will need to activate our asset verification system. Can you wait a few more minutes? Renato said yes, and while he waited, he looked through the window at Paulista outside and felt, for the first time since he opened that beige paper envelope, that something very big was about to reorganize around him. The confirmation took 22 minutes. Edvaldo Marques returned to the room with the posture of a man who had left as a manager and returned as something completely different. He still didn't know exactly what, but different. There were two employees behind him, discreet, as if they didn't know exactly the protocol for a situation that no banking manual had precisely predicted. Mr. Alves, said the manager, and the change in tone was audible even to those who weren't paying attention. We have just verified with the asset system and the notary office where the will was registered. The information contained in the document you brought is correct. You appear as the main beneficiary of the inheritance of Mr. Armando Vasconcelos, with immediate access to accounts linked to the estate in the consolidated value of, he consulted the paper in his hand, 2,348,000,000 reais, in addition to corporate stakes that are being formally transferred. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed longer. Renato didn't say anything immediately. He stood looking at Edvaldo Marques with that expression people have when the world says something that the brain refuses to process at normal speed. Then he looked at the paper in the manager's hand, then at the window, then back at the manager. I need to sit down. Of course, of course. Edvaldo pulled his own chair to the side of the table so that Renato could sit in the most comfortable place. One of the employees went to get water without anyone asking. In the following minutes, Edvaldo Marques began to speak with an attention and care that contrasted so radically with the coldness of the previous 40 minutes of waiting that it would be almost comical if Renato were in a condition to find anything comical at that moment. The manager explained that a legal and financial team from the bank itself would be available to assist in the asset transition, that there would be absolute secrecy, that there was a VIP room available whenever Mr. Alves wished, that the bank had every interest in being the preferred institutional partner in this process. Renato heard it all. He thanked him with few words, took the documents, left Adriana Fonseca's card with the manager for direct contact, and left the branch. Outside, Paulista followed its rhythm. The sun was higher now, and there was that white midday luminosity that makes everything on the avenue more contrasted, sharper. Renato walked to a small square near the subway station, sat on a stone bench and stayed looking at the ground. 2 billion. The word kept spinning without anchoring to anything concrete. It was a number that belonged to another universe, the universe of economic news, of business pages, of people he had never met personally, and who seemed to exist in a different layer of the same city, where he spent his mornings serving customers who asked for chocolate milk and soap. He thought of his mother. She had left when he was 18 without leaving letters, without leaving explanations about the father he never really knew. She had said, in one of the rare times the subject came up, that Renato's father was a man who belonged to a different world, and that this world was dangerous for those who were not born into it. Renato always interpreted that as evasion, as the way she found to not have to say that his father had simply abandoned the two of them. But maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it was protection in a way he still didn't completely understand. He called Adriana Fonseca. She answered on the second ring, as if she were waiting. "I already verified at the bank," he said. "I know. Edvaldo Marquez called me before you." There was something close to a smile in her voice. "How are you?" "I don't know yet. I need to understand what happened, who this man was, why I never knew anything. That is exactly why we need to talk in person. I have documents and a letter that Mr. Armando left specifically for you, written in his own hand before he left. It explains a lot." A pause. "Can you stop by the office tomorrow morning? It's in Jardins, near the Consolação subway." Renato agreed and hung up. He sat in the square for a while longer. A pigeon landed a few meters from him, tilted its head to the side, and left without any apparent conclusion. A pair of young people passed talking loudly about something that had happened at night. The city continued without pause, as always. When he finally got up to go back to Belém, Renato felt he had crossed an invisible border that morning. He didn't know yet what was on the other side. He didn't know what the dead father's letter would say. He didn't know what it meant to be the owner of an empire he had never even dreamed of. He only knew that something had shifted permanently, like a stone that rolls and cannot be put back in the same place. And on the way back, while the subway cut through the dark tunnels under the city, he thought of Priscilla. Not with bitterness, not yet. He thought of her with the strangeness of someone looking at a scene that was real a short time ago and already seems to belong to another life. She had said he would never be someone. She had said it with such certainty, with such calm conviction, that it was almost impossible not to wonder what she would say now, on that Friday when the world had decided, without warning, to completely change its mind about who Renato Alves was. That night, in Carlone's spare room, Renato couldn't sleep. He stayed looking at the ceiling with his eyes open, the lawyer's letter still folded in the pocket of the pants he had left on the chair. Carlone noticed that his friend had returned different and didn't push. He heated up a packet of soup for the two of them and respected the silence for the rest of the night. Lying in the darkness, he reviewed what he knew. Armando Vasconcelos, a name he had never heard before that morning, but which carried a weight capable of reorganizing everything he had built as an identity in 32 years. A father who had known of his existence since forever and chose to keep him away from a world that, according to his mother, was dangerous for those who were not born into it. Was there anger in this? Maybe. But there was also something he still couldn't name, a mixture of curiosity and sadness, like when one discovers the key to a locked drawer too late to ask what was inside. What he knew about the Grupo Vasconcelos was almost nothing. Just the name that appeared on the facades of developments on Faria Lima, in business magazine articles, on construction signs. One of those abstract conglomerates for those outside the circuit. And now it was his. The word his sounded strange even inside his head, like new clothes that need time to mold to the body. The next morning, he woke up before the alarm, got ready with the best he had in his backpack, and caught the subway toward Jardins. Adriana Fonseca's office was in a two-story house with a discreet facade on Haddock Lobo Street. A bronze plaque on the door said, Fonseca Advocacia and Consultoria Patrimonial. Inside, a beige leather sofa and well-tended plants guarded the specific silence of places where serious matters are handled with discretion. Adriana Fonseca received him at 9 in the morning with the same objectivity as the previous day. She placed a folder of documents on the table and on top of it a smaller envelope of yellowish paper with the name Renato written by hand in a firm calligraphy. "This letter was written by your father 3 months before he left," she said. "He asked that it be delivered personally, only to you, and only after the asset verification was completed." She stood up. "I will leave you to read alone. I will be in the hallway if you need anything." Renato was left alone in the room. He looked at the envelope for a moment, at that calligraphy written by a man he had never seen, but who carried half of everything he was. Then he opened the envelope and unfolded the 3 sheets inside. The first line said, "Son, if you are reading this, then the moment has finally arrived that I should have created much sooner." Armando Vasconcelos's letter was 3 pages long and took almost 20 minutes to be read. Not because the words were difficult, but because Renato had to stop several times. His father wrote with the precision of someone who had spent decades managing contracts and negotiations. But there was something in those lines that was not business language. It was the language of a man who knew he was writing to a son he had never met and who probably carried accumulated questions throughout an entire life. Armando told that he had been involved with Renato's mother, Vera, for a little over a year, when he was still in the process of separating from his first wife, Claudinha, as he called her, with whom he had 2 older children. The relationship with Vera had been real, but the timing was impossible. There was family pressure, pressure from partners, pressure from a world where image and reputation were currency, as valuable as money. Vera had discovered the pregnancy at a time when Armando had not yet found enough courage to face all these pressures head-on. They reached an agreement, silent and painful, which Renato's mother kept with a dignity that his father described with visible admiration in the words. She never asked for anything. She never sought him out. She raised her son alone, with what she had, and never allowed the weight of that story to fall on the child. Armando, in turn, had followed from afar for years, knowing the name, knowing the city, knowing that his son had grown up and moved to São Paulo. When he got older, and the children of the first family already had established lives, the regret began to be heavier than the fear. He tried to approach through third parties twice, but backed away. When the diagnosis arrived, 2 years ago, and made it clear that time was not infinite, he stopped backing away. He formalized the will, hired Adriana Fonseca, left precise instructions. The letter ended like this: "You owe me nothing, Renato. You don't owe me gratitude. You don't owe me forgiveness. You don't owe me any reverence to a memory that does not exist between us. What you do with what I left is entirely your choice. I only ask that you know that what you built alone with your own hands, without the name and without the money that should have been yours from the start, says more about who you are than any inheritance ever will. Your father, Armando." Renato folded the sheets carefully, put them back in the envelope and stood looking at the table for a long time. When Adriana returned to the room, she found him standing by the window, looking at Haddock Lobo Street outside. "Do you have questions?" she asked. "I have many, but I think they are not for now." He turned. "I want to understand how the transition process works. What needs to happen for me to actually take over?" Adriana nodded and opened the document folder. In the following 2 hours, she explained the structure of the Grupo Vasconcelos with the clarity of someone who had spent months preparing for that conversation. The conglomerate had 3 main pillars: a logistics division called Transvasc, with fleets and warehouses spread across São Paulo, Minas and Paraná; a real estate developer called Vasconcelos Empreendimentos, with projects underway in the neighborhoods of Moema, Vila Mariana and on the coast of São Paulo; and an agribusiness division with stakes in cooperatives in the interior. There was also a delicate issue. The 2 children from the first family, Bruno and Leandro Vasconcelos, knew that a third heir existed. The will distributed stakes to each one, but the control of the group, the presidency of the board, had been destined exclusively to Renato. "Do they already know it's me?" Renato asked. "They know that a main heir exists. They don't know yet who it is. That changes at Monday's board meeting." Adriana crossed her arms slightly. "It's going to be a tense moment. I need you to be prepared." Renato thought for an instant. How much time do I have to prepare? 2 days. 2 days to learn to be someone else, or rather, to discover that he already was that person, that he just didn't know it yet. Adriana offered him immediate access to an apartment that was part of the estate, in the Jardines neighborhood on Oscar Freire Street, furnished and available. There was also a team of assistants who would be at his disposal for whatever was necessary in that transition period. Renato left the office in the early afternoon, with the folder of documents under his arm, and the soft weight of an entirely new life settling on his shoulders. It wasn't the weight of sadness, nor that of euphoria. It was the weight of the real, that specific type of gravity that big things have when they stop being an abstraction and start to exist for real, with an address, with a schedule, with consequences. He still hadn't called anyone. He hadn't told Carlo. He hadn't said anything to Adriana about Priscilla. There was something that needed to be kept for a while, processed in silence before being shared with the world. Like someone who wakes up from a disturbing dream and needs a few minutes with eyes open to be sure they are in fact awake. That afternoon, for the first time in 2 days, Renato Alves smiled. It was a small smile, almost internal, the type that is not seen by anyone, but that changes the rhythm of breathing. He was in the middle of the sidewalk on Haddock Lobo Street, with the November sun hitting the tall trees, and realized that the feeling he had now was not of arrival. It was of a beginning. At the end of that afternoon, after leaving the documents in the Oscar Freire apartment and spending some time walking through the rooms of that space that was now his, Renato made the first call he had postponed since the morning. He called Carlo. His friend listened to everything in silence. The only sign of life was the breathing and the small sound he made when Renato mentioned the 2 billion, something between a word and a sigh. When Renato finished, Carlo was quiet for a few more seconds. Then he said, "You're going to need a suit." Renato laughed. It was the first real laugh in days, one of those that rises from the chest without warning and brings inside it something close to relief. "I have 2 days to show up at a board meeting of one of the largest companies in the country as the main heir," Renato said. "Suit, good shirt and closed shoes?" Carlo said with the authority of someone who had watched a lot in life without ever letting himself be dismantled by shock. "I know a tailor shop in Bom Retiro that makes it in 24 hours. They went together the next day. The tailor, a man with precise hands named Mr. Ibrahim, measured Renato with seriousness and promised to deliver the next morning. Carlo sat near the window, with that expression of someone who is doing something important without needing to say it. Back at the apartment, Renato spent much of the night reading the documents in the folder: management reports, organizational charts, history of the group's divisions, board minutes from the last 2 years. It was a lot to absorb in a short time, but there was a clarity in the numbers that he recognized, like the cash register of the store with more zeros and more people involved. What worried him were not the numbers. It was Monday's board meeting. Bruno and Leandro Vasconcelos, the half-brothers he had never met, would be at the table. Adriana had said they were men accustomed to power, and that the arrival of an unknown third heir to the highest position would not be received with flowers. There would be resistance, and this resistance would need to be faced with calm and firmness, the same qualities he had practiced his whole life without knowing that one day he would need them in a meeting room on Faria Lima. He fell asleep at 2 in the morning with documents scattered across the bed. The apartment silent, and São Paulo outside with that orange luminosity that the city never completely abandons. On Monday morning, when the suit arrived wrapped in tissue paper, and Renato put it on in front of the mirror, he looked at his reflection. It was the same face, the same expression people described as solidity. Only now there was a new context around that face, and Renato was learning that context changes everything without changing anything. He left at 8:30, called a car through the app. The destination was an address on Faria Lima that, from that day on, was also his. The Grupo Vasconcelos building on Faria Lima had 24 floors with a dark, mirrored facade, of the type of glass that reflects the sky and neighboring buildings, creating a surface that seems to contain the entire world without revealing anything of what is inside. There was a discreet sign on the marble of the entrance, GV Holding. 2 security guards in grey uniforms flanked the access. A receptionist with impeccable posture operated a visitor panel with the precise movements of someone who had done it thousands of times. Renato arrived accompanied by Adriana Fonseca, who walked by his side with the black briefcase on her arm and the neutral expression of someone who controlled the situation without needing to demonstrate it. She had guided him over the weekend on how to behave before people who would try to test his legitimacy. "Bruno will question the will," she had said the previous night, sitting at the table in the Oscar Freire apartment with the documents open between them. "He is a lawyer. He knows the mechanisms. He will look for any procedural inconsistency. Leandro is different, more emotional. He can be more direct in hostility. The important thing is that you do not respond on the same frequency. Let the documents speak." The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the boardroom on the 12th floor. Present, in addition to Renato and Adriana, were the legal representatives of the two brothers, the financial director Mauricio Sales, and a notary who would certify the formal acts. Bruno Vasconcelos was 41 years old, in a dark blue suit, a posture of someone who had grown up knowing exactly who he was and what belonged to him. When Renato entered the room, Bruno looked at him with the expression of a person who is evaluating a problem before deciding how to solve it. There was no open hostility. There was something colder than that, the suspension of judgment before the verdict. Leandro was 2 years younger, taller, with a restlessness in his face that Bruno didn't have. When he saw Renato, he slightly raised his chin like someone recording something unexpected and needing a second to recalibrate. Adriana made the formal introductions. The notary distributed copies of the documents. And then it began. Bruno opened the hostilities with surgical courtesy. "Before proceeding with any formality, we would like to better understand the context of the relationship between Mr. Armando and the mother of Mr. He paused for a millisecond. "Alves." "It is documented," Adriana said before Renato needed to answer. "Formal recognition in a notary office, DNA performed in an accredited laboratory, will registered with sufficient advance to ward off any questioning about mental state." "DNA can be contested," Bruno's lawyer said. "A second test can be requested, of course, but the result will be the same." Adriana opened the folder and distributed another copy. "I suggest the process move forward and that any contests be handled through judicial channels if necessary. What cannot happen is to suspend today the formal reading of the will, which is a notarial act with public faith." There was a brief tension, of the kind that exists more in the air than in words. Bruno looked at his lawyer. The lawyer made a slight head gesture that meant, "She is right. We can't block it here." The notary began the reading. Renato stayed quiet during the entire process. There was something in that room that required silence, a collective gravity that loud words would have profaned. He heard his name being read with formality and felt the weight of the two brothers' gazes. When the notary finished, there was a moment of silence. Leandro was the first to speak, and contrary to what Adriana had predicted, it wasn't on the frequency of direct hostility. "Did you know we existed?" "No. I found out about everything this week." Renato looked at him. "I also didn't know he existed until Friday." Something in Leandro's face changed. It was subtle, but it was there, a slight dissolving of the rigidity that was there in the first few minutes. Bruno did not demonstrate anything equivalent. "That doesn't change the situation," Bruno said. "My father had 32 years to recognize this relationship formally and did not do so while he was in full capacity. The fact that he formalized it when his health was already compromised raises questions." "Your father wrote me a letter," Renato said. "It wasn't an answer to the legal argument. It was something else. He didn't ask me for anything. He just explained and left the choice in my hands." He stayed silent for a second. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I came because the will asks for it. What we do with what he left from here on can be built in different ways." Bruno looked at him for a long moment. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair, the first more relaxed movement since the beginning of the meeting, and said, "Let's hear from Mauricio." Mauricio Sales, the financial director, opened his laptop and began presenting the group's numbers, and while the spreadsheets and graphs appeared on the screen, Renato paid attention to every detail because he had understood, at that moment, that the most important meeting was not today's. The most important meeting would come later, when the world knew who the new chairman of the board of Grupo Vasconcelos was, and when certain people who had dismissed him as irrelevant discovered in a completely unexpected way that that world and theirs were the same. The meeting lasted another 2 hours. Mauricio Sales presented the consolidated state of the group with precision, but there was a difference that morning. There was a new chairman of the board in the room, and each number carried a different meaning. Renato asked questions, few but the right ones, about Transvasque's margin, which had fallen in the last quarter, about a real estate contract pending renewal, about open labor lawsuits. Mauricio answered carefully, stealing glances toward Bruno, like someone who had not yet decided which side to tilt his loyalty toward. Bruno observed Renato with a different attention, less evaluation, and more contained surprise. Leandro asked for a break. The two brothers went out for 10 minutes. When they returned, Bruno sat more directly, less defensive. "We are not going to contest the will," Bruno said, "for now, but I want to make it clear that we expect the transition to be conducted with total transparency and that the stakes guaranteed to us be respected to the letter." "That is documented and does not change," Adriana said. "Then there is nothing more to discuss for today." Bruno closed the folder. "Welcome to the group, Renato." It was formal courtesy, not human warmth. But it was more than Renato had expected. Leandro, upon leaving, looked at him for a second longer, with the expression of someone who is reviewing a conclusion formed in haste. When the room was emptying, Mauricio Sales approached with the discretion of someone who wants to say something outside of protocol. "Mr. Alves, this morning's questions were exactly the right ones. Mr. Armando always said that the health of a company is in the numbers that shrink without explanation." He extended his hand. "I am at your disposal." Renato shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mauricio." Adriana was waiting for him in the hallway with her folder closed and an expression that was the closest to satisfaction she habitually demonstrated. "It went well," she said as they walked toward the elevator. "It was more tense than I expected." "It was less tense than it could have been. Bruno knows that the battle he would lose is worth less than the one he can win by cooperating. Leandro will take longer to process it, but he is not hostile by nature." The elevator went down. Renato stayed looking at the reflection of the two of them in the mirrored doors, descending toward the first floor of a construction that, 3 days ago, he didn't know existed in his life. Outside, Faria Lima continued with its dense traffic and its energy as the city's financial capital. There was something almost ironic in that. There was still much to do. Visit the facilities, meet with the directors, understand the people beyond the numbers. He also needed to decide what to do with the store on Bompasta Street, that small business that had been the most honest proof of who he was before Friday. And there was another thing that was being gestated silently. Adriana had mentioned, almost in passing, that the following Thursday the group would receive partner companies seeking to renew or sign contracts, a monthly formal networking event. There was an opportunity in it that Renato had not yet completely named, but that was taking shape with the inevitability of things that need to happen for a story to reach the place where it was always destined to be. The Thursday of the partnership event arrived with a clear sky over São Paulo, one of those rare November days when the city seems to have breathed deeply during the night and woken up with a washed atmosphere. The hall on the 12th floor had been reorganized to receive the guests. Round tables, each with discreet identification, white flowers in low vases, coffee and sparkling water service circulating on silver trays. It was the type of environment that Grupo Vasconcelos used to build and renew commercial relationships without anything looking like a negotiation, exactly because everything was a negotiation. Renato arrived at 9:15, 15 minutes before the formal start. He had spent the 3 previous days immersed in the numbers and structures of the group, accompanied by Mauricio Sales, who proved to be a valuable ally, not through immediate sympathy, but by the quality of what he knew, and by the way he had chosen to share that knowledge without a filter of old loyalty. He was a professional who respected competence, and he had recognized, in the questions Renato asked, the competence he needed to respect. Adriana arrived shortly after and did the usual quick briefing. 23 companies confirmed, among them suppliers of inputs for Transvasque, smaller developers seeking partnerships with the real estate division, and a communication agency, that wanted to renew the group's marketing contract. There were also 2 new companies which had no previous link with the group and were there for the first time. "Is there any I should pay special attention to?" Renato asked. Adriana consulted the tablet. "A medium-sized construction company, GF Construtora, which has been seeking partnerships with larger developers in recent months. The representative is the founding partner, a man named Gilmar Furtado." Renato stayed motionless for exactly 1 second, then he said, "Understood." If Adriana noticed any change, she didn't show it. She was the type who processed information without comment, unless the comment was necessary. The hall filled up. Guests arrived in groups of 2 or 3, greeted the hosts, got coffee, distributed themselves among the tables. Renato circulated with the naturalness he had practiced in recent days, introducing himself by name, without unnecessary titles, asking the questions that opened conversations instead of closing them. He had learned, over years in the store, that people like to talk about what they do when they perceive that the person asking is genuinely listening. Priscilla and Gilmar arrived at 10:20. She entered first, in an olive-green dress, her hair loose and her shoulders positioned with that posture she adopted in environments she wanted to impress. Gilmar came behind, 2 centimeters taller than her, in a pinstriped suit, a stage confidence that revealed itself in the way he swept the hall with his gaze before taking the first step. He was the type of man who needed to know where he was before starting to move. The 2 were led by one of the assistants to the GF Construtora table. They got coffee. Gilmar greeted 2 men he already knew and did that type of hallway talk that exists only to demonstrate that one knows people. Priscilla stayed by his side, smiling at the right frequency, playing the role she had rehearsed. Renato observed them for a few minutes from afar, with the same calmness with which he had closed the door of the Ipiranga apartment on that Thursday night. There was no anger in what he felt. There was something more like clarity, the feeling of someone who completely understands a situation without needing to exaggerate what it means. It was Mauricio Sales who led the formal part of the opening, briefly presenting the structure of the event and the chairman of the group's board. When Mauricio said the name, Renato was standing at a point in the hall visible from almost every angle. The name was said. Renato took a step forward and greeted the room with a discreet nod and a brief sentence of welcome. It was a simple gesture, but it carried everything the last few days had built: the well-made suit, the posture that didn't need to prove anything because it already was, the voice that didn't rise because it didn't need to. On Gilmar's side, Priscilla stood still. She looked at Renato for a long moment, with that specific expression of someone who recognizes something that the brain refuses to accept in the first fraction of a second. Then she looked at Gilmar, who had also stopped. Then she looked back at Renato. Renato did not look at her. He continued leading the opening with attention distributed throughout the entire room, as if he were anywhere else in the world that morning, as if there were nothing specific in that hall besides the work he had come to do. But there was, and all the next movements of that morning would depend on how each of those 3 characters chose to react to the simple and irreversible fact that the world had reorganized while no one was paying attention, and that the man who had been expelled from a rented apartment with a backpack on his back was now standing in front of everyone, in the only place where the power of that room was concentrated. The event followed with fluidity. The tables rotated, representatives talked to those responsible for each division. Coffee was replenished in a background noise with the specific tonality of business done in a social environment. Renato circulated through 3 tables before passing by the GF Construtora one. He didn't go directly. There were more priority companies, and he treated them with attention, asking questions, listening to proposals, delegating technical details to Mauricio. When he reached the GF Construtora table, Gilmar was standing with a glass of sparkling water in his hand, talking to one of the group's assistants. Upon seeing Renato approach, he activated his automatic professional smile. "Gilmar Furtado, GF Construtora," he said, extending his hand firmly. "Renato Alves." He shook the hand. There was the moment, brief but sharp. The moment when Gilmar processed the name, the face, and the memory of something that should fit, but didn't fit on the right scale. Priscilla was 2 meters away, and Renato felt without needing to see that she had stopped completely. GF has projects in the southern axis of the city, if I'm not mistaken, Renato said, returning to professional ground with the naturalness of someone who never left it. That's right, yes. Gilmar recovered quickly. He was smart, that much was clear. We have 2 developments in Santo André and 1 underway in Ipiranga. We are seeking partnership with larger developers for the next launches. Ipiranga is growing a lot. It's a neighborhood I know well. Renato said this without any special inflection in his voice. It was information. Precise, true information, and absolutely loaded with everything that didn't need to be said. Gilmar looked at him for a fraction of a second longer. Priscilla took a step toward the conversation. Renato. He turned around. He looked at her as he would look at any other person in that room, with polite attention and professional distance. Priscilla, he said, do you represent GF as well? She was without an answer for an instant. It was a simple and completely destabilizing question at the same time, because it framed everything that had happened between them within the neutral language of business, placing her exactly where she had placed everything in her own life, on a transactional plane. Yes, I am the company's relationship assistant. I see. He nodded slightly, as he did with everyone. I will ask Mauricio to continue the conversation about the partnership. He is the one who has the details of the real estate division. He turned to Gilmar. It was a pleasure. He walked to the next table. Behind him, he could imagine without needing to see. Gilmar putting together pieces of something he hadn't asked to understand. Priscilla, with her gaze fixed on the back of someone who had left her apartment with a backpack and who was now the most important person in the hall. Mauricio appeared at Renato's side with his usual discretion. Do you want me to dedicate myself especially to them? Renato considered for a moment. Treat them like any other company. Evaluate the Ipiranga project with the same criteria as the others. If it makes sense for the group, move forward. If it doesn't, don't move forward. Understood. There was no revenge in the gesture. There was the application of a principle learned in the store, valid both for a bag of rice and for a 20 million contract. The value of something is what it really is, not what the person selling it says it is. And as the morning progressed and the event followed its course, Renato felt he had fulfilled something in that hall that wasn't about Priscilla and wasn't about Gilmar. It was about himself, about the feeling of being in the right place, doing what needed to be done without needing to prove anything to anyone other than himself. The event ended at noon with coffee and handshakes. The hall was emptied in waves, groups leaving with exchanged cards and conversations still open. Renato stayed until the end, saying goodbye to each representative with genuine attention. Priscilla and Gilmar were among the last to leave. She had tried, at 2 moments, to approach in contexts that seemed casual. He responded with neutral cordiality, redirecting to professional ground. When the hall was almost empty, she returned. Renato was near the window with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking at Faria Lima below. He heard the steps before seeing her, because there was something in the rhythm of that stride that he had learned to recognize in 3 years of living together. "Can I talk to you?" she said. He turned around. "You can." Priscilla had the expression of someone who had spent the entire morning rehearsing what she would say and who, faced with the real moment, realized the rehearsal had not been enough. Her eyes swept the empty hall, his suit, the window behind, as if she were looking for an entry angle that worked better than the others. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I know you didn't know." He said this without accusation in his voice. "I didn't know either." "Renato," she breathed. "What I said on Thursday was cruel. I know that. And I know that money and inheritance don't change that. They don't undo what happened." "They don't undo it," he agreed. And it was a true agreement, not a trap. Priscilla looked at him with that expression of someone who had expected to find anger or coldness and found something harder to deal with, clarity. "I was unfair to you, to everything you built, to what you are." "You were honest about what you wanted," Renato said. "It wasn't pretty to hear, but it was honest. You wanted a man with money and status. You found Gilmar. That is the path you chose." She opened her mouth and closed it again. There was something in what he said that was neither accusation nor forgiveness, just the exact description of the facts, and this exactness left little room for argument. "The GF contract," she said after a moment. "Gilmar really needs this partnership. The company has debts that he doesn't tell anyone about. This Ipiranga project is what can save his situation." Renato stayed in silence for a moment. There was something in that he needed to process with care. It wasn't a request for a favor. It was information offered with an intention that she herself perhaps couldn't completely name, a mix of late honesty and the old instinct of trying to find a bargaining chip when everything else had failed. "The evaluation of the project will be done by Mauricio with the normal technical criteria of the group," he said. "If the project is viable and the partnership makes sense, it moves forward. If it doesn't move forward. This doesn't depend on me helping you or hurting you. And if I asked you to evaluate with more," she searched for the word, "attention. It is already being evaluated with attention, like all the others." The silence that followed was different from the other silences of the morning. It was the silence of a door that closes without noise. Priscilla looked at him for a long moment, and then something happened that he hadn't expected. She didn't argue anymore. She didn't beg. She didn't try another angle. She just stood looking at him with that expression of someone who finally sees something that was right in front of them all along, but that needed a certain angle of light to appear. "You were never what I said you were," she said, almost to herself. "No," he said. "I wasn't." She nodded slightly, took the bag she had left on a nearby chair and walked toward the elevator. Renato stayed looking at her leave for the second time in less than a week, but this time there was something fundamentally different in the scene. It wasn't him leaving. It was her. And there was between the two versions of the same goodbye a distance that was not measured in days or in money, but in everything that happens to a person when they are forced to discover, all at once, what they are really worth. Gilmar was waiting for the elevator in the hallway. When he saw Priscilla come out, he looked once at the hall, saw Renato standing by the window, and looked away. It was the gesture of someone who understood something without needing it to be explained. The elevator arrived. The two entered. The doors closed. Renato was left alone in the hall with the cup of already cold coffee in his hand, and Faria Lima outside with its midday traffic and its mirrored buildings reflecting each other in an infinite game of images that said nothing about what was inside them. Mauricio entered through the side door with the tablet in his hand. "The people from the Ipiranga project left the technical proposal with the reception. I'll analyze it this week." "Great," Renato said. "Give me the summary when you have it." And that was it. The day continued. There were meetings in the afternoon, a working lunch with the directors of Transvask, a call with the legal office for an update on the asset transfer processes. The group's life didn't stop for anything, and Renato was learning every hour that this was exactly what a board chairman needed to understand first. That the world doesn't stop for you to process what you're feeling, and that the best answer to almost everything is to continue. That night, Renato went to the store for the first time since the Friday that changed everything. There was no practical reason. The store had been closed for a week, but there was the need to see that place with the eyes of what he was now, to understand what to do with it. He arrived in the quiet rhythm of the early evening, the bakery with its light on and the smell of bread. The store was dark, the shutter closed, the notice still pasted where he had left it. He stood outside looking at the simple facade. There was a blue sign above the shutter with Armazém Alves, in white letters that he himself had painted with a thick brush 2 years ago, with Carlo holding the ladder. The store was good. It had been built from nothing and grown because the people in the neighborhood trusted him. Not the name, nor the capital. That was worth something that didn't appear on any balance sheet. He decided on that sidewalk that he would not close the store. He would talk to Carlone to take over the management with fair remuneration and resources to expand the stock. The store would continue to be what it always was, only with the conditions it had never had. It was a small decision in the context of everything he had inherited, but it said something about who he chose to be in this role. Not someone who abandons what he built because he can afford to forget, but someone who remembers where he came from because he knows that this path is part of what made him capable. He took the notice off the shutter and put it in his pocket. He called Carlone while walking, and his friend answered on the first ring. "I have a proposal for you," Renato said. "Tell me when you can talk." "You can talk now, I'm at home," Renato told him while walking down Bompasto Street, quiet at that hour, with that yellow sodium light from the poles and the irregular stones of the sidewalk that he already knew by heart. Carlone heard it all. When Renato finished, there was a pause. "You're offering me the management of your store." "Of our store," Renato said, "if you agree." Another pause. Then, "I'm going to need a decent salary." "You'll have it. And autonomy. I don't want you ordering to change the layout every week just because you have money now." Renato laughed, the same laugh as when Carlone had said, "You're going to need a suit," the one that came from a clean place. "Total autonomy," he said, "with monthly accountability." "Deal," Carlone said. Renato hung up and kept walking without haste, with São Paulo around him in that early evening mode, the small pause between the chaos of the day and the noise of the early morning. There was something in that moment that he wanted to preserve, in the way he moved through the world, with his feet on a neighborhood street, and the awareness that the place where one is has as much value as the place where one is going. The following week would bring the official communication about the new chairmanship of the board, the technical evaluation of the GF Construtora project, and Mauricio's decision based on the numbers. And it would bring, inevitably, the next chapter of everything that had begun on a rainy Thursday in Ipiranga, when a man went down a wet staircase with a backpack on his back and discovered that the fall and the beginning were the same thing. 3 weeks after the partnership event, the Grupo Vasconcelos published an official communication to the market confirming Renato Alves as the new chairman of the board. The text, drafted by Adriana with approval from Bruno and Leandro, was precise and neutral, like all communications of that type, but there was in a final passage a sentence that Renato had asked to include personally. "The transition reflects the group's commitment to continuity and to the values that were the basis of its foundation, consistent work and attention to people." The repercussion was quick. The business press published profiles, journalists asked for interviews, and Renato's LinkedIn started receiving requests in an unusual volume. Mauricio Sales presented the evaluation of the GF Construtora project at the board meeting following the communication. The Ipiranga development project had technical merit, the plans were well made, and the land survey was consistent. The problem was in the construction company's own financial numbers, a debt ratio that made the partnership risk too high for the standard the group adopted. Mauricio's recommendation was not to move forward at that moment. Renato read the report carefully, confirmed that the criteria were the same applied to the other proposals, and approved the recommendation. There was nothing personal there. There was a company with the wrong numbers at the wrong time, and a decision based on what the numbers said. 2 days later, Adriana informed him that GF Construtora had requested reconsideration through her office. There was a letter from Gilmar Furtado asking for a meeting to present new guarantees. Renato instructed Adriana to inform that any new proposal would be evaluated by the same technical process and that the decision would be Mauricio Sales's, not the chairman's. Gilmar did not ask for a second meeting. The news of the decline reached Priscilla through Gilmar himself that same night, according to what Renato learned weeks later from a lateral and unsolicited source. Her reaction, according to that same source, had been silence. There was no scene. There was no recrimination. There was simply the recognition that the consequences of certain choices present themselves in the exact way they were planted. What happened between the two after that was none of Renato's business, and he was deliberate in not seeking to know more than what had reached him without him asking. In the second half of that month, Renato spent 3 days visiting the Transvasc facilities in Guarulhos. It was a large operation with hundreds of employees, fleets of trucks, logistics warehouses, and a management team that had worked for years under a model that needed updating. He walked through the warehouse corridors with the operational director, talked to the drivers during the lunch break, heard the complaints that never reached the board meetings because someone along the way always thought they weren't worth the boss's time. He returned from Guarulhos with 3 pages of notes, and the conviction that the drop in margin he had identified at the board meeting had a specific cause that the reports didn't capture. There was a bottleneck in the fleet maintenance scheduling process that generated delays and extra costs that accumulated silently throughout the quarter. It was the type of problem that only appears to those who go to see with their own eyes, and Renato had learned this lesson at the store, where the difference between what the spreadsheet said and what happened on the shelf always had a reason that needed to be found personally. Mauricio stood looking at the notes for a long moment after Renato presented them. "This is exactly what Mr. Armando used to do in the early years of the group," he said, "before the company grew so much that it became difficult." "So the company grew and forgot how it became big," Renato said. Mauricio nodded with the expression of someone hearing something they knew, but that needed to be said out loud to exist for good. Bruno was present at that meeting and stayed quiet during most of it. At the end, when everyone was getting up, he walked to Renato and said in the low voice of someone who doesn't want the sentence to become a speech, "My father would have liked this conversation." It was the first thing Bruno said to him that did not belong to protocol. Renato looked at him. "Thank you." Bruno nodded and left. It was a beginning. Fragile, still full of distances that would need time to diminish, but it was a beginning. And Renato had learned, in those intense weeks, that beginnings are more valuable than arrivals, because arrivals are fixed points and beginnings are directions, and directions can lead anywhere, as long as the person following them knows where they placed their feet the last time they stopped to look down. The store on Bompasta Street reopened on the first Monday of December, with new paint on the facade and double the stock. Carlo had worked over the weekend to organize everything and had placed a new plant in the window, a mother-in-law's tongue that he said brought good energy to the business. Renato stopped by in the late afternoon, spent 10 minutes having a coffee at the counter while Donna Conceição bought her liter of milk and complained that the neighborhood was changing too fast. "But the store continues the same," she said before leaving. Renato looked at Carlo. Carlo raised his shoulders like someone saying, "What do you want me to do? She's right." "It continues," Renato said. And it was true. In everything that mattered, it was true. That week, Leandro sent a direct message via WhatsApp proposing an informal coffee without an agenda. Renato accepted. They met on a Tuesday afternoon at a corner cafe with iron chairs on the sidewalk. Leandro arrived without a tie, which was information in itself. "I want to tell you something I didn't say at the board," Leandro began after ordering his coffee. "When my father fell ill, he called me and said there was something important he needed to resolve before leaving. He didn't say what, he just said there was a debt of courage he had let grow for too long." He stirred the cup without drinking. "I didn't understand at the time, now I do." Renato stayed quiet, listening. "I grew up knowing my father was a man who made difficult decisions," Leandro continued. "In business, always. In his personal life, not always." He raised his eyes. "This is not an excuse for what he failed to do for you. It's just context." "I received his letter," Renato said. He explained what he could explain. "I know. Adriana told me there was a letter." A pause. "Did you get angry?" Renato considered the question with honesty. "Not angry, something more like sadness, but it passed." Leandro nodded. "Bruno takes longer to process things, but what he said at the end of the meeting was real. He doesn't say things he doesn't feel." "I know." They stayed in silence, both with their coffee in front of them and the traffic passing. "I don't need you to be my brother," Leandro said. "That would be asking too much too fast, but I would like to work well with you. I think the group can be something better than it was with the divided management we had." "I think so too," Renato said. "Then we have something in common." "We do." Leandro drank the coffee. Renato drank his. Then they talked about soccer for 10 minutes, the lingua franca of two men who didn't yet have the vocabulary for everything that was between them, but knew it is built little by little. When they said goodbye, Leandro extended his hand. Renato shook it. There was in that shake something different from the ones that occurred at the board. It was the gesture of two people who had chosen, each for themselves, to do differently than what fear asked. Renato walked back down Oscar Freire with the late afternoon sun hitting the shop windows and São Paulo around him with that energy of days when the city seems to organize itself for something. There was much work, Transvasc to correct, the real estate division to expand, people to meet. Bruno would need time. Leandro had already taken the first step. Carlone was at the store with the mother-in-law's tongue in the window. And there was himself, Renato Alves, 32 years old, son of a man who had taken long but in the end found courage, raised by a woman who had it all along. Walking down a beautiful street with his feet on the ground and his head in order, without needing to prove anything to anyone other than himself. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. 6 months later, on a morning in May with that dry cold that São Paulo sometimes has in autumn, Renato Alves arrived at the Faria Lima building at 8:15, the same time as always. The security guards at the entrance already knew him by name. The receptionist already knew that he took his coffee without sugar and that he preferred to go straight up without passing through the waiting room. There were visible changes in the 6 months. Transvasc had implemented the new maintenance scheduling system, and the quarter's margin had risen 4 points, one more than the projection. The real estate division had closed 2 new development contracts in neighborhoods that the group had neglected, and Mauricio Salles had been promoted to executive director, a position that created a direct channel between operations and the board without the intermediate layers that had generated the information bottleneck Renato had identified in the Guarulhos warehouses. Bruno had retreated from his initial posture of cautious distance to something that was not yet warmth, but was active respect, the kind that appears when one person observes another work well for long enough, to no longer be able to ignore what they see. They spoke weekly, usually by a quick call, about numbers and decisions, and occasionally something longer that had the flavor of a real conversation. Leandro had become the closest interlocutor. They frequented the same cafe on Tuesdays, with a regularity that had become a habit without anyone having formally decided it would be so. They talked about soccer, about management, about their parents, about the years they didn't have in common, and about the things that despite this seemed to belong to both. The store on Bompasta Street now had 3 employees besides Carlo, one of them hired specifically to make deliveries in the neighborhood. The blue sign with Armazém Alves continued in the same place, with the same font and the same colors, because Carlo had said that changing the sign would be the most unnecessary thing someone could do, and Renato had agreed without needing to think much. On that May morning, before going up to the 12th floor, Renato stood for a moment in the building's lobby, looking at the street outside through the tinted glass of the facade. It was early, and the movement was still growing. A young man passed by on a bicycle with a backpack on his back. A woman waited for the bus with a closed umbrella on her arm, prepared for the weather that São Paulo reserves for those who are not paying attention. He thought of his father's letter. He had reread those 3 pages a few times in the last months, not to find different answers, but to check if the questions were changing with time. They were. The questions about absence were being replaced by other, more interesting ones about choice, about what people do with the fear they feel, and what they do with the courage they find late. There was no resentment in those rereadings. There was something more like understanding, which is different from approval and different from forgiveness. It is simply seeing things as they were, with the exact dimension they had, neither larger nor smaller. He thought of his mother, of what she had carried alone and what she had decided not to pass on, of the silence that was, in fact, a form of protection that he had only been able to see from back to front, after the story was complete enough to have perspective. There was a dignity in that which he wanted to honor, the only way he knew how, by being himself, a man who carried what he needed to carry without placing on others the weight that was his. When the elevator arrived and the doors opened, Renato entered, pressed the 12th floor button and stood looking at the reflection of himself in the mirrored doors while the elevator ascended. It was the same face, the same expression people described as solidity. The same person who had descended a wet staircase in a building without an elevator in Ipiranga with a backpack on his shoulder, on a night when the rain had stopped and the air smelled of damp earth and of a beginning. The elevator reached the 12th floor. The doors opened. Renato went out, greeted the assistant who was arriving with the first coffee tray of the day, took his cup and walked toward the boardroom where there was work to be done. As there always was, as there always would be. And that, he had learned, was exactly enough. End of story. If Renato's story touched something in you, if you have ever felt underestimated, ignored, or discarded by those who did not know how to see beyond what the eyes reach, then you know what this story carries. A person's value is not in what they have, it is in what they are when no one is looking. Leave a comment telling us what you felt. We really want to read what this journey awakened in you. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the perfect moment. Here you will find stories that believe in ordinary people, in silent twists, in beginnings that look like falls. Click like if Renato deserves this gesture, and we'll see you in the next story, which promises to be as intense as this one. We are waiting for you. In the months that followed, Renato continued learning that leading a large company is no different from leading anything small in what really matters. It's about people, about what they need, about what prevents them from doing well, what they know how to do. It's about listening more than talking and about not confusing silence with a lack of opinion. It's about understanding that the map is never the territory and that the only way to really know a business is to cross it with your own feet. Mauricio had become something close to an involuntary mentor, not by age nor by hierarchy, but by the quality of everything he knew about that group, and by the way he had chosen to share that knowledge without reservations. It was the type of loyalty that is not bought and is not asked for, which arises when one person recognizes in another something that is worth the investment of being honest. Bruno and Leandro, each in their own way, were becoming less of an issue to be managed and more of a reality to be inhabited. There was a strange story between the three of them that none of them had asked for and that none of them could undo. They were brothers of a father who had loved in imperfect ways and who had tried to correct what he could correct in the time that was left. That was not little. It was perhaps enough to build something. On a June afternoon, Renato passed through Ipiranga by car on his way to a visit to the real estate division's construction site and told the driver to stop for a moment on the corner of Bompasta Street. He stayed looking through the window at the store's facade with the blue sign and the light on inside. There were customers, there was movement. There was Carlo behind the counter with that expression of someone who is exactly where they need to be. It was a small scene. It was also the most precise scene of everything that had happened in those months, the proof that what is built with honest work does not need to be abandoned when life changes. It can be taken along. It can continue to be what it always was while everything around grows. The driver resumed the path. The construction site was 20 minutes away, in the neighborhood Renato had lived in for 3 years, without knowing that one day he would be part of a project of his own. It was life being ironic in the way she likes, without warning, without explanation, just putting things in the place that was always theirs, while no one was paying attention in the right direction. He arrived at the site, got out of the car, put on the helmet the responsible engineer handed him at the entrance, and walked through the construction site with his eyes open to everything there was to see, as he always did, as he had learned he needed to do, because the true value of a person, he had discovered, is not in what they receive, it is in what they do with what they receive, and in what they already were before receiving anything.